Señoras y señores, buenas tardes. Les damos la bienvenida a la conferencia central del doctor Joseph Stiglitz. Agradecemos la presencia de autoridades de esta casa, profesores, empresarios, alumnos y personal no docente. Queremos agradecer también muy especialmente a las empresas que han hecho posible la visita del doctor Stiglitz. Esas son Banco Santander Río y la empresa OCA del grupo RUO. Preside esta actividad el señor decano de esta casa de estudios, profesor doctor César Albornoz, y lo acompañan en el estrado el profesor Joseph Stiglitz, economista, Premio Nobel de Economía del año 2001, el señor Patricio Farcuh, presidente y CEO de OCA, y el profesor doctor Andrés López, director pedagógico del Departamento de Economía. A continuación, escucharemos...
Falta uno. Daniel.
También agradecemos al señor Daniel Heyman, ¿sí?, de UBA CONICET.
Aplausos.
A continuación, escucharemos las palabras del señor Patricio Farcuh.
Soy contador de la UBA y amo esta facultad y quiero tratar de devolverle a este establecimiento muchas cosas de lo que pude aprender y tener y desarrollar. Por otro lado, es un honor, Joseph, poder conocerlo. Estudié mucho sus teorías y las hablé con Nicolás. Y la verdad que admiro mucho su trabajo, con lo cual es un honor. Muchas gracias, César. Un placer, Joseph. Andrés, encantado. Y Daniel, un placer.
Con este convenio se acuerda la creación de un programa de actividades en la República Argentina en temas de macroeconomía, el desarrollo y la desigualdad. Ambas partes cooperarán y promoverán la investigación internacional en el área de economía. Esta casa y el Instituto Rich están de acuerdo en que este convenio constituirá una importante contribución al estudio y discusión del desarrollo económico, desde la perspectiva de los países en desarrollo, particularmente de América Latina y más particularmente aún de la República Argentina. Brindamos, pues, un fuerte aplauso por este acuerdo.
Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Buenas tardes, doctor Stiglitz. Patricio, bueno, la verdad que ha sido un gran placer conocerlo. Yo no tenía referencia, no lo conocía. Hemos entablado unas comunicaciones telefónicas, yo en el exterior y él desde Buenos Aires, y la verdad que me resultó una persona con mucha fuerza y con mucho ímpetu, y que a nosotros como universidad o como facultad nos va a hacer muy bien, porque nos va a servir para hacer este trabajo tan importante que hacemos nosotros en la universidad, que es la extensión. O sea, mostrar nuestra universidad hacia afuera, y creo que esto es lo más importante de lo que tenemos. Andrés López y Daniel Heyman, que también colaboraron en la organización de este evento. A ver, nosotros como universidad estamos, la verdad, muy orgullosos de poder contar nuevamente con el doctor Stiglitz, acá que ya es un asiduo concurrente a nuestra facultad. La verdad que esto nos enorgullece porque ponemos en valor todo lo que en realidad hacemos diariamente en esta casa para nuestros alumnos, nuestros investigadores y nuestros docentes. Este acuerdo que hemos firmado con el Instituto de Investigación para el Desarrollo, la Economía y el Crecimiento, creo que nos va a ayudar a fortalecer fuertemente todos los trabajos de investigación que hacemos en los distintos campos, tanto macroeconómicos como deuda externa, deuda soberana, ingresos, desigualdad, etcétera. Me parece que esto va a afianzar todos los conocimientos que nosotros ponemos en valor a través del instituto que dirige Daniel Heyman, como desde el Departamento de Economía que dirige Andrés López. Creo que esto es lo que a nosotros nos fortalece como institución pública, porque estamos evidentemente con un esfuerzo bastante importante en que desde lo académico podamos mostrarle a la sociedad qué nosotros podemos hacer con respecto a determinados elementos y eventos que vamos a hacer. Así que para nosotros es un orgullo, esta es la casa de todos y esta es la casa en la cual nosotros queremos transmitir todos los conocimientos que desde la academia para poder volver a poner a nuestra universidad y a nuestra facultad en los niveles que siempre tuvo y que siempre debería haber estado. Así que muchísimas gracias a ustedes por estar acá, al doctor Stiglitz por ser nuevamente un invitado de esta casa, que ya prácticamente es como si fuera de nuestra casa, y con este acuerdo de este instituto y los, tanto desde el instituto nuestro, de la facultad, como desde el Departamento de Economía, poder fortalecer mucho más los lazos para poder trabajar en conjunto sobre los temas en los cuales son hoy problemática en el mundo y que a nosotros nos sirve. Así que muchas gracias a todos y la verdad que es un placer. Gracias.
Antes de presentar al doctor Stiglitz, que de cualquier modo no necesita presentación, y como dijo César, ha sido visitante de esta casa y de hecho ha recibido el doctorado honoris causa hace unos años por parte de nuestra universidad. Les quiero contar brevemente que esta es la conferencia central de una serie de actividades que REACH, que es el Research Institute for Development, Growth and Economics, que fue creado en el 2013, primero con sede en Uruguay, con el apoyo de la International Economic Association. REACH y la facultad han organizado una serie de actividades ahora en Buenos Aires, que se desarrollaron los días 17, 18 y también terminan mañana, que son 3 talleres sobre temáticas específicas, uno sobre temas de deuda soberana, otra sobre crisis macroeconómica y otra sobre políticas industriales y desarrollo. Y adicionalmente estos 3 talleres donde se presentaron papers y se hicieron paneles especiales, hay un taller para alumnos que ha tenido una concurrencia muy nutrida de más de 100 alumnos de distintas universidades del país, en donde varios de los invitados a estos talleres han expuesto y entonces hay una actividad no solo de la típica nuestra de presentar papers y discutirlos, sino también de formación de alumnos de grado avanzados y de posgrado, y esperamos que en los sucesivos años podamos repetir y mejorar estas actividades con un poco más de organización de este año, porque esto ha sido un poquito, ¿no? Podemos escribir podría ser un paper adicional en la organización, cómo llegamos hasta hoy aquí, pero por suerte todo in the end, ¿no? Las cosas convergen. Bueno, sin más, lo presento al doctor Stiglitz, que como todos saben ha recibido el premio Nobel en el año 2001, recibió la medalla John Bates Clark en 1979 y es profesor de la Universidad de Columbia, ha escrito innumerables papers y libros que seguramente muchos de ustedes conocen, entre los últimos The Price of Inequality, Free Fall, America's Free Markets and the Sinking of the World Economy y Creating a Learning Society, que entiendo que es el último libro que escribió el doctor Stiglitz, y actualmente es presidente de la Initiative for Policy Dialogue y fue presidente de la International Economic Association en el pasado reciente. Así que, sin más, esperamos entonces la conferencia del doctor Stiglitz. Y muchas gracias por visitarnos una vez más y por entender las peculiaridades de la organización en los trópicos.
Well, thank you very much for this invitation to address you again about one of my newest books. Actually, I've come out with a couple ones in the last few months. And this is Creating a Learning Society, so I might as well advertise it a little bit. This is the shortened version of a much longer book, which has a lot more of the mathematics behind it. And what I'm going to do this evening is go through the basic ideas, not through the mathematics, but through the basic ideas that underlay this book. So there are 2 basic themes. One is that a successful and sustained growth requires creating a learning society, especially in the 21st century in the move to a knowledge economy. And the second and equally important one is that markets on their own won't do this. There needs to be systematic interventions by the government. So there's a long-standing debate about the role of the state. What I'm going to try to argue is that part of that debate is really mired in the 18th century, and that in the 21st century, views about the role of the state need to change. And this book is an attempt to try to articulate at least part of the argument. So to put the first argument more forcefully, the transformation to what might be called learning societies that occurred around 1800 for Western economies, and more recently for those in Asia, appears to have had a far greater impact on human well-being than improvements in allocative efficiency, or even than on the accumulation of resources, physical capital, and even human capital. So the striking thing is that for literally hundreds of years, standards of living had not changed at all. And you can see that in this chart where it goes back to 1,000, but if we went back before 1,000, it wouldn't look any different. It's basically a flat line going back historically. And then suddenly, around 1800 in the case of Europe, and somewhat later, somewhat later in the case of Asia, these things start to change. Constructing this data is not easy, and obviously there's some dispute. So another way, it's always important to look at different data sets. Here's another data set, which is the real wages of London craftsmen since 1200 to 2000. I didn't put this data together. I'm borrowing extensively from others. If you look at that data closely, you'll see a little bump around 1300. That's the Black Plague, when there was a scarcity of labor and real wages went up. So this does show that, to some extent, market forces are at play. Real wages are affected with labor demanding supply. But the basic picture shows that going back to 1200 to around 1800, there were no real changes in real wages. And then again, beginning roughly 200 years ago, they started to increase. The scientific method provided a systematic way of figuring out how to improve productivity. That is to say, getting more outputs from inputs. As an aside, I probably won't be able to follow up on this in this talk because of lack of time. That change in mindset is associated with the creation of democracies. And that's why I think, this is somewhat controversial, that sustaining increases in living standards, especially in shared prosperity, will require sustaining democracies. Well, the idea that technical change was so important is not as it's been an old idea. It began to develop in the beginning of the 20th century with the work of Schumpeter. And then with the work of Solow, there was an attempt to quantify it, ascertain what fraction of the growth in living standards was a result of learning, technical change. And while there's not precision, the general sense was well over 75, 80%. One of the interesting things is it's not a surprise that innovation did not play a very important role in Adam Smith's work. He talked about a pin factory and the role of specialization. He didn't talk about how to make pins more efficiently in terms of innovation, in terms of a process of learning. And that was precisely because the Enlightenment that I just described in the previous slide occurred just as he was living. In fact, he was a major contributor to the Enlightenment. So all those events which led to all those technical changes which are associated with the increases in standard of living that began around 1800, 1820, happened after Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. So it would be foolish for anybody in the 21st century to look back at Adam Smith and ask, what did he think about the issues of efficient resource allocation or about how to create wealth? he called it the wealth of nations and how to create wealth. But the real source of wealth is this kind of learning and innovation, which was something that happened largely, partly because of him, but largely after him. So, in the case of developing countries, the focus is not just on moving the frontier out, but it's in the diffusion of knowledge and catching up with advanced countries. And this was a view that when I was chief economist of the World Bank, we tried to articulate very forcefully that what separates developing countries from developed countries is as much a gap in knowledge as a gap in resources. And that's going to be important in the story I'm telling, because much of what traditional advice, like that associated with the Washington Consensus, was focused on allocative efficiency and closing the resource gap, not closing the knowledge gap. And the two are often lead to quite different policies. But there's another point I want to emphasize, and that is, even in developed countries, there are very large gaps between the most efficient firms and the average and the least efficient firms. In other words, there are large disparities in knowledge even within the most advanced countries. And that means even within the most advanced countries, there's a large role for learning, a large role for those who are behind to catch up. And I should emphasize that actually when you look at various aspects of technology, there are lots of things that each firm can learn from each other, that there may be one firm advanced in one area and another firm in another. So this brings me to the second major theme. The first theme is that the major increases in living standards are associated with learning, increases in technology, not with improvements in the efficiency of the allocation of resources in a static sense or the accumulation of capital. The second theme is that markets don't solve this problem on their own. Markets on their own are not efficient in promoting innovation. Again, this is an idea that we have known for a very long time, since the work of Kenneth Arrow, who began the formal analysis of the economics of R&D. There are many properties of R&D that make it different from that of ordinary goods. For instance, knowledge is like a public good as opposed to a private good. A private good is if one person consumes the good, some other person can't. A public good is a good like the fact that I tell you what I've just told you means that you know it, but I still know it. Or to put it in another way, much more poetically, Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States, and he articulated in the following way. He said, knowledge is like a candle. When one candle lights another, it doesn't diminish from the light of the first candle. So the point I'm trying to make is that many of the critical properties that we assume for conventional private goods don't hold for knowledge. There are large spillovers. I'll talk about them more later. And there are other important imperfections related to imperfections in risk markets, capital markets, and competition, which are inherent in the innovation process. And those mean that markets are not efficient in promoting innovation. So this fundamentally changes the presumption from Smith's invisible hand. Adam Smith argued that individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest would lead, as if by an invisible hand, to the well-being of society. And what this analysis says, that's not true. Or as I put it in a lot of, Bruce and I put it in much of our earlier work, we said the reason the invisible hand is often invisible is that it's not there. And that means that markets on their own do not lead to efficient resource allocations. And that in turn means that there is an important role for government policy. So the policies that promote a transformation to a learning society are markedly different than those traditionally advocated by economists, or I should say neoliberal economists, which focus on improving the static efficiency of resource allocation and accumulation of capital, and including policies that many of you are familiar with that constituted the Washington Consensus. And the last line here is really the most important. From the perspective of creating a learning society, many of the Washington Consensus policies are actually counterproductive, and I'll give some examples later on. This basic idea, in a way, it should be familiar, but it's one that I think has not been given the attention that it deserves. There's a long recognized conflict between static and dynamic perspectives. The context in which that's seen most clearly is intellectual property. Intellectual property restricts the use of knowledge, which is obviously a distortion. As I said, because knowledge is a public good, there should be no restrictions on the use of knowledge. And intellectual property contributes to monopoly power, which is a huge distortion. We are willing to accept this distortion because of a belief in the dynamic benefits and a belief that these dynamic benefits outweigh the static cost. Just as an aside, I probably, again, won't have time to talk about it, but as people have studied many aspects of intellectual property, particularly under the intellectual property regime in the United States, we've come to the view that there actually may be negative dynamic benefits. So you have a static cost and negative dynamic benefits in current intellectual property regimes. Finally, I should note the important role that Argentina has played at the World Intellectual Property Organization in pointing out that there is a need for a development-oriented intellectual property regime. And that's quite different from the intellectual property regime that's embedded in the WTO in what is called the TRIPS, the trade-related intellectual property system, which is, of course, not trade-related. It's all related. So everything falls within its ambit. Well, if it is the case that most of the increases in standard of living are related to innovation and learning, then that implies that the central question of growth and development should be what should governments do to promote growth through learning. And this is a question which is especially salient because such policies may come in conflict with conventionally advocated policies. So what one needs to do is look comprehensively at the factors affecting learning. And that's what we try to do in this book. I'm only going to be able to talk about a few of the elements, but the basic argument that we try to argue, put forward, is that essentially every aspect of our society, not just our economy, affects this capacity to learn. We need to look at all policies and institutions through the lens of learning, how they affect capabilities, how they affect incentives, how they facilitate learning and catalyze it, and how they, in some cases, actually impose impediments to learning. And if I have time, I'll explain how IPR, for instance, imposes some important impediments to learning. So there are associated with this some fundamental underlying questions, which is how does learning occur? How do we learn to learn? How do we convert an emerging economy like Argentina or any of the other countries into a learning economy and society? So these are the things that I want to very briefly look at. But I'm going to begin with a topic that is not normally associated with learning to emphasize the fact that this gives a lens through which one can look at almost all economic policies. So I'm going to come and I'm going to talk a little bit about education, which is a very natural topic when you're thinking about learning. I'm going to talk about industrial policies and why this learning perspective gives an argument for trade and industrial policies. But I want to begin with something that is not normally associated with learning at all, and that is macro stability. What we argue in the book is that stability is important to learning. And there are several reasons for this, and on the slide I've highlighted 3 of them. First, knowledge, much of knowledge resides within institutions. There's organizational learning, institutional learning. And the one of the important set of institutions are firms. And when firms go bankrupt, which that happens when you have a deep recession, there's a destruction of a lot of organizational capital, a lot of organizational learning. So in a lot of the standard macro models, there are productivity shocks in our real business cycle. And I always viewed it very funny because they have this idea that there's a negative productivity shock. And it's always very strange. How could it be the case that knowledge moves backward? It's sort of like a collective amnesia hit the entire economy. Well, the answer is not that there's a negative productivity shock, but if economy goes into a deep recession and 20, 30, 40, 50% of the firms go bankrupt, as happened, for instance, in Korea, Indonesia, Thailand, then there's a lot of organizational destruction and a loss of knowledge. The second reason, anybody in business understands that, is you can only focus on certain things at one time. And if you're trying to survive, you can't learn. More generally, one of the things that is very clear, and I'll show this a little bit later, very clear that in the midst of economic downturns, firms do not spend a lot of resources in learning and in doing R&D. They're focusing on just getting by, on surviving. And the final point is that recessions impede the most important aspect of human capital accumulation, which is on-the-job training. I'll come back to that when I come to education. So an example of the implication of this is the enormous destruction of potential growth that has been a result of the Eurozone crisis. And the next chart illustrates this. The red line shows the relatively smooth increase in GDP over the period 1980 through 2008. And I've drawn a dotted line to show where the line, what would have happened if that growth had continued. The green line shows what actually happened. There are a couple of things interesting about the green line. One of them is you don't see any real benefit of the euro. It never had any, it was never a good idea. But now, after 2008, you see when people say, what happened to Europe? They made one mistake. And it shows you making one mistake can be very costly. And that was the euro. I think Argentina knows a little bit about those kinds of mistakes from its own past. Now, the interesting thing there is that you see the gap between where Europe might have been if it had continued to grow and where it actually is actually continuing to grow. That actually there's no real recovery. And we're now 8 years after the beginning of the euro crisis. And there's no evidence that of a restoration. The magnitude of these losses is huge, and our standard metrics don't fully capture the magnitude of these losses, and that's why on this particular side, I reflect a view of the, I served on an international commission that was appointed by Nicolas Sarkozy on the measurement of economic performance and social progress, and emphasizing that metrics matter. And because Europe has not realized the destruction of the potential growth that has occurred because of their inadequate response, the negative effects on learning and the effect of that on future standards of living, they've undertaken in part policies that have inadequate resolve to address the problem. So I want to move now on to a second topic, which is one which of course is very naturally related to learning. But here I want to take a slightly different perspective and begin by reminding you that what happens here at the university or in the years preceding the university, in your first 16 or 20 years of schooling, is a small part of learning. It's the less important part, even though you are very absorbed in it right now. And obviously, you have to do well in order to do well in the other parts. But what I want to emphasize, what we should be doing in these first 16, 20 years of education is teaching you how to learn. In other words, it should be about learning how to learn. So the old model was basically your brains were sort of sponges, and in a few years we tried to stuff as much stuff in that sponge as we could, knowing that in a few years you'd forget most of it and it would be obsolete and wrong anyway. And probably much of what we told you was wrong when we told it to you. So the good news of the internet now is that you have access to more knowledge than we could possibly stuff into those spongy brains with all the hard work that we could. But the difficult question is accessing and, more importantly, analyzing, processing that information, figuring out what to do with it, how to make sense out of it all. And so in that sense, today, education, even more than before, is about learning how to learn. That means that we have to think more deeply about the role of formal schooling versus what happens after you finish. That is to say, with on-the-job, or sometimes we call it lifelong learning. And this is especially true not only because of the changes in technology that I referred to earlier, but also changes in the nature of the labor market itself. So because of a more dynamic labor market, there is less provision of education by employers. There's greater uncertainty about the nature of future jobs, implying a greater need for individuals to have access to relevant continuing education. It's also the case that learning perspective has changed our thinking about education in developing countries. And this was one, I think, of my major contributions when I was chief economist at the World Bank, and that was articulated in the Rural Development Report in 1999 called Knowledge for Development. It reflects the view that I already said, that what separated developed from developing countries was this gap in knowledge. So the view before that was that countries had scarce resources and they ought to devote all those resources to improving primary education. There was a good rationale for this, and the argument was it was more egalitarian. You give access to education to everybody at the same low level. But the perspective that we wanted to give across is that that would not allow these countries to close the knowledge gap. It was important for everybody to have a basic level of literacy, to everybody to have basic levels of skills. But if the developing countries were ever to close the the gap with the developed countries, they had to have good universities with at least a basic level of university education that would allow them to close the knowledge gap. And if you look at the most successful countries, like those countries in East Asia, that's precisely what they did. They gave a high level of universal education, but they also invested a great deal in university education. Well, I couldn't help but put together a little data here to show where Argentina was and on percentage of GDP on spending. And Argentina is actually not too bad, a little better than Paraguay, much better than Chile, and much better than Peru. Peru, I should say, has been working very hard to improve those numbers. But of course, one of the important things to realize is that it's not just the amount of spending, it's the quality. And one of the things that many of the Latin American countries have had a problem with is doing well on the quality of education. So this is the rankings of the PISA scores, which are the standard measures comparing the quality of education across countries. And Argentina can feel good that in areas like science, it is just a little bit above Argentina, a little bit below Jordan. But the point is, these are not, particularly given the spending, are not as good as scores as one would have hoped. Well, let me just say, the percent of youth in university education has been going down slightly, and that also should be of concern. Let me now go on to talk a little bit about trade, because that's really what began our work in this area. The standard theories on trade focused on static comparative advantage, and that highlighted the one-time gain from liberalization and opening up of markets. But our argument was very strongly that what leads to increases in living standards has to do with learning. That means that one has to focus on the diffusion of knowledge, including the diffusion of knowledge from developed to less developed countries and diffusion within countries, spillovers from one sector to the other, and learning within any sector. The example, and there's a second idea here that's very important, and that is much learning is only done by doing. This is an idea that Ken Arrow first talked about, well, actually people called learning by doing. So the idea is you can't learn to be producing steel by opening up a textbook. The only way you learn how to produce steel is actually by producing steel. And this idea was very important, for instance, in the early development of Korea. The static comparative advantage of Korea, and when it began its development trajectory in the 1960s, the static comparative advantage for Korea was in growing rice. And the IMF and the World Bank said to Korea, you ought to specialize in growing rice. And Korea's response was, thank you, but no thank you. So they ignored that efficiency that they'd learned from Adam Smith. And they said, if we're going to be a modern economy, we have to have learning and technology. And the only way we're going to become an advanced country is by beginning to produce the goods of advanced countries. So they brought in steel, they brought in producing chips, they did a lot of other things. And they very quickly became very successful. So that by 1997, the Korean steel mills, state-owned steel mills, let me say, were more productive than any private steel mill in the United States. And that was why in the East Asia crisis, the IMF insisted that they privatize Korea's steel mills so that it would be fair competition to America's inefficient private sector. That was a joke. That really wasn't what was, it was an ideology based on privatization. But the fact was, at that point, their steel mill was actually very efficient. And I had the chance actually to go to POSCO right after a year after they had privatized, and asked them, and this is an aside, but an interesting story. I asked them, what difference did being private versus public make? They said there were two differences. Now, as corporate CEOs, corporate executives, we have much more discretion. Then we had oversight from both Parliament and the administration. So we had to be very efficient. We had to pay attention to what we were doing. Now, we have these board of directors that don't really pay much attention to what we do. So we have a lot more scope. And the second thing was, then all of our profits went to improve societal efficiency. They had created the MIT of Korea and trained a whole generation of engineers. And now all their profits were going to pay dividends to their private owners. So their view was that it wasn't unambiguously a positive thing. The privatization had not worked out quite so successfully. But so anyway, it was just interesting. So going back to the underlying theme of this talk, markets wonder best in learning sectors, especially those with large learning spillovers to others, and when there are imperfections in capital markets and imperfections in risk markets, which is always the case. So this explains the important role of government in promoting innovation and learning, and that's true today. It was true in the 19th century. The first telegraph line was laid by the US government. The internet was financed by by governments. Agricultural advances in the 19th century were largely financed by government. In fact, there's a very nice book that I recommend to you very strongly called The Entrepreneurial State by Mazzucato, who describes that most of the important innovations have been actually a result of entrepreneurial government activity. And that the private sector plays an important role in bringing it to the market, but that's based on government-funded research. So even the browser, for instance, was first developed by the government, and it was then brought to the market and then captured by our monopoly. So all of this emphasizes the important role for government. Now, this provides the rationale for industrial and trade policies. And what we argue in this book is what we call the infinite economy argument. There used to be an argument that goes back to the 19th century called the infinite industry argument, that industries need time to grow and that there needs to be protection. The emphasis of the infinite economy argument is quite different. It really says that the growth of particular industries, like the steel industry in Korea, brought enormous externalities to the rest of Korea. Externalities in terms of the education, in terms of the institutions like the development of financial markets, in terms of broader understanding of the industrialization process. So that there are large spillovers from in the process of industrialization. So obviously, when there are these externalities, when there are spillovers, markets won't provide the right amount, and there'll be under investment. Unfortunately, the WTO has restricted the set of instruments that can be used protection in the 19th century was a standard part of industrial policy, trade policy. And there's a very nice book called Kicking Away the Ladder, which basically describes how in the 19th century, advanced countries use these, but now in the 20th and 21st century, they prescribe the ability of other countries to do it. So countries have to be more, emerging countries today have to be cleverer in how they do it. They have to do it through research policies, education policies, and the use of exchange rate policies, including competitive, stable real exchange rates. So the basic idea is based on dynamic comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is endogenous. There's no reason why Switzerland has a comparative advantage in growing watches. There's nothing about the mountain air in Switzerland that resulted in it knowing how to engage in watches, in knowing and allowing it, that resulted in it knowing how to engage in tax evasion or in corruption and all those activities. All those can be learned, and many societies have succeeded learning a variety of these activities. So I'm not suggesting that those are good necessarily, but what I want to say is that whatever your comparative advantages, they are dynamic, they are learned in a modern economy. It's not based on rainfall, it's not even based on location. So with learning by doing, dynamic comparative advantage is affected by what a country produces. So central then to understanding the structure of learning within an economy, including within and across sector. And here just exemplifying the kinds of spillovers that there are many processes, practices, and institutions that extend across sectors even, like inventory control processes, labor management processes, computerization, financial services. So far I've emphasized learning, but I also emphasized in discussion of education, learning to learn, and I think that's even more important. Industrial and trade policies can enhance an economy's learning capacities, but this, of course, in turn introduces very complicated dynamic strategic questions. So I've talked about one aspect of learning, and that's one aspect of increasing standard technology, and that's learning by doing. The other one is formal research, and just like learning by doing, markets will undersupply research, especially basic research, and because it's a public good. And I would argue it's even important for developing countries. First, they have to do R&D for adapting existing technologies to circumstances of their country. Those circumstances are often markedly different from the advanced country where the technology was developed. It's important for that R&D to facilitate the transfer of knowledge. It's part of the learning process. One of the interesting things, I spent some time working at Bell Labs. I don't know if you know, Bell Labs was the one private institution, and it wasn't really private in the full sense, that probably did more innovation than any other. It did the transistor, the laser, and it was all basic research. And they never made any money out of it, but the society as a whole benefited enormously. And I would often ask them, why are you investing so much in basic research? And one of the answers was that it was only by doing the basic research themselves that they could figure out what research was relevant for their own technology of telecommunications. So it's a really interesting example, and I think the same thing is true for developing countries. And finally, I note here for leapfrogging, and Actually, in several areas, Brazil has shown that it is possible to do that kind of leapfrogging in the development of sugar-based ethanol technology, dual flexible cars. Now they've even succeeded in developing commercial basis of converting sugar into, I don't know if this is a good idea, but sugar into plastics. So that rather than having oil-based plastics, you can have it based on renewable energy. So this just gives you a picture if you want to see where Argentina stands in this basic picture as a percentage in 2012. And you see that it doesn't do, it's about half of what your neighbor Brazil and clearly much less than many other countries. Well, I'm running out of time, and I want to leave some time for let me just say that there are a lot of political economy objections to this, and let me just say they're all wrong. And if I had more time, I would explain why they're wrong, but I'll make 2 points. One of them is that every successful country has actually had these industrial policies. There are none that really have succeeded without them. And the second point is every country actually, either whether they're successful or not, has an industrial policy. The only difference across countries is that some countries know they have industrial policies and others don't. And if you don't know that you have industrial policies, you're probably having an industrial policy that is being determined by somebody else that's manipulating you. So the point here is, and I think it's an important one, is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. Markets have to be structured. And my most recent book has actually just came out a couple of weeks ago called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy. And the basic idea of this book is that beginning about a third of a century ago, we began to rewrite the rules of the American economy in ways that led to less efficiency and more inequality. And now the agenda has to be to rewrite the rules once again to make it more efficient and less unequal. But in the area of industrial policy, you can see this. What was the rule that the big rewriting the rules? It was financial market deregulation. That sounds innocuous. But that agenda was an industrial policy. And there were many aspects. It wasn't just deregulation. For instance, in the bankruptcy law, they said that when you go bankrupt, it used to be in every civilized country, the first claimant when somebody goes bankrupt is the workers, because the workers can't get their labor back. But in the United States, we said the first claimant were the derivatives, the CDSs, those things that AIG engaged in that led to, for one company, a $180 billion bailout. And for those of you who don't know, $180 billion is a lot of money. So the point is that this was an industrial policy. When I say industrial policy, shaping the economy, that's all I mean. Shaping the economy for the financial sector. The financial sector grew from 2.5% to about 8% of GDP without any effect on the productivity of the economy. In fact, a slowdown in the growth of the economy and an increase in instability. So we had a policy, a sectoral policy, an industrial policy, but because we weren't thinking about it, we let the financial sector choose our financial policy, our industrial policy, and they chose one that undermined the efficiency of our economy and increased inequality in our society. So the basic lesson is the design of industrial policy has to reflect the capabilities and capacities of the government. Broad-based export subsidies like exchange rate policies were the policies that are now being used in China and turned out to be very, very effective in promoting industrialization in East Asia. So let me go on to some other implications of the theory just from an academic point of view. This also provides a new theory of the firm. Those of you who may know, Coase had a theory of the firm that talked about transaction costs. What this points out is, emphasizes is that one of the determinants of the boundaries about what happens inside a firm and outside, most economic activity actually occurs within firms and not mediated by prices, is that within firms you want a free flow of knowledge. Across firms you have boundaries which restrict the flow of knowledge. And so the structure of the economy, even with respect to the structure of the organization of firms, has an effect on societal learning. Intellectual property, I've already hinted at the main point I want to raise, which is poorly designed intellectual property can lead to a slowing of innovation, because one of the things that intellectual property does is restrict access to knowledge, and knowledge is the most important input to the production of knowledge. So you have to have a balanced intellectual property regime. And there's a growing consensus among American academics, particularly, that the United States and the advanced countries have an unbalanced intellectual property regime. So there's some general lessons. This is another example of what might be called second-best economics. But whenever one talks about innovation and learning, one is in the world of second-best economics. There are going to be credit constraints, imperfect competition, risk, all elements of the standard Schumpeterian economics, and all of these should be at the center of endogenous growth theory and growth policies. Unfortunately, much of the policies have focused on simplistic models which have left out one or more of these elements which are inherent in the innovation process. And so they cannot give us insights to those kinds of issues. I would be remiss if I didn't mention a couple of other things. First, I've talked about growth, learning, innovation. One needs to ask, to what end? Much of the innovation in advanced industrial countries so far has been directed towards saving labor. And the fact that that's the case is evidence of itself that something's wrong with the market economy. There's something very strange in the United States that we see. For instance, we have a high level of unskilled labor, of unemployment of unskilled labor. And yet we have a lot of innovation creating machines to create more unskilled unemployment, when what we really need is to save the planet from climate change. So something is wrong with the, we know part of the reason it was wrong, that we aren't giving the right incentives for the direction of innovation, the extent to which it's saving labor versus saving the climate, reducing carbon emissions or other environmental needs. So we understand a little bit of what is going on, but it's all evidence that the market, as it's currently structured, isn't doing right. So we need a new model of innovation. And these environmental impacts are important for all countries, but I think they're especially important for developing countries. Two more points that I'll make very briefly. One is, at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that what was the source of the change that led to this enormous burst of increasing standards of living was the Enlightenment, which was a change in the mindset. But so far I've talked all about economics in a narrow technical sense. And that brings us back to a question: how do we gauge in, how do we in particularly, this is a problem of less developed countries, not emerging markets, but more of the less developed countries. How do we engage in the social transformation and the creation of a learning society? How do we engage, how do we succeed in creating that change in mindset that we associate with the Enlightenment? Now let me make it very clear, even in advanced countries, the people who understand the Enlightenment are a minority. One of my friends in the Obama administration who is engaged in climate change says that every day he has to relitigate the Enlightenment. He has to explain to the Republicans about science, about, there are these things, this thing called knowledge and research, and he's exhausting. And you don't want to go back every time to go back to the basic ideas of the Enlightenment. But he says every day that's what life is like. So it is quite remarkable. This is, again, a little bit of an aside, but it's an interesting one. And it shows you the importance of culture and mindset. Normally, one would think that more learning would be associated with a greater understanding of science. You would hope our education system does that. But in the United States, if you do a regression, if you do about the level of education and belief in climate change, there's a negative relationship. More educated people are more likely to be climate skeptics. Now, I see somebody's faces a little bit, you're supposed to be scandalized. So what is going on? What is going on here? It's actually an easy thing to understand once you understand, but it tells you something about society that goes beyond economics and is, again, I think really important. More educated people in the United States are more likely to be Republicans because they're higher income. I don't mean this talk to be a political talk, and I know Argentina is very politicized, so I shouldn't try to, but these are just facts. And there has been created within the Republican Party a belief that climate change doesn't exist. Climate denial is part of the culture of the Republican Party. Not everyone, but it is a dominant ethic. And that is why there's this negative relationship. Well, the reason this is so important is that it emphasizes the importance of culture, the importance of trying to create the societal transformation. It's a constant battle of trying to understand the principles of science, of economic science, to try to make sure that people aren't living in the 18th century and believing still in Adam Smith. That's an example of being trapped in the 18th century. When you think that the invisible hand still works, that's a kind of ideology. There are some set of assumptions that under which that is true, but they don't describe any modern economy. So in our book, we have one chapter where we discuss these kinds of issues. So the final thing, the general principles of a learning society have broad implications for the entire economic regime. And I've listed on this slide many examples, but the real point I wanted to raise today was this gives a different lens for looking at economic policy. That economists have traditionally looked at economic policy in a very static sense. If there was innovation, it was exogenous, it wasn't endogenous, it wasn't something that was determined within the model. And yet we know that the decisions that began to be made 250 years ago that led to the increases in standard of living that allow us to have the kinds of living standards we have today were a result of conscious decisions of people making, of how they organized their society. So the objective of this lecture has been a new lens through which one can examine all the policies I listed in the previous slide and other policy choices facing developing countries and developed countries. The countries might like to pretend that they could avoid matters of industrial policy. One of the important points I emphasized was that they cannot, that every economy effectively has some form of industrial policies, and more narrowly, matters of educational policy, the design of the education system, matters of expenditure policy, how you shape your infrastructure. These are also social decisions which have to be addressed collectively, and have to be addressed collectively asking the question of how they are shaping the society and the economy, and whether they're creating more of a learning society. And the choices they make in each of these arenas will inevitably shape the economy, politics, and society, for better or for worse, for decades to come. Thank you.
My question would be, when you talk about comparative advantages, in particularly that, for example, Switzerland wouldn't have to make watches, it doesn't grow watches, but it has the knowledge to make watches, and it costs time and effort to gain that knowledge. What would happen if in the society, in our global society, all the watches could be produced by Switzerland? Would it make sense that another country learned how to make watches? I mean, in all your, and this goes also for other things that you said, I think that you haven't addressed quite the costs of learning. I don't know if...
The static is what you're paying today. The dynamic are the benefits that you're getting in the future. And what we prove in the book is that it always pays, for instance, to engage in some degree of these industrial policies. So they're, in other words, if you ask the question, if Korea had a choice between no industrial policy, just growing agriculture, just growing rice, or having some degree of restrictions on the importation of steel or importation of other industrial goods, is it desirable for it to do some of that, catching up with Japan, catching up? It's investing, it's losing. There's a cost to doing this, absolutely. But what we show in the book, that it's always worth it for it to do this to some extent. And the extent to which we derive here a optimal formula for the extent to which it pays to do it, which depends on things like the elasticity of learning, the magnitude of the spillovers, the share of the sector. There's some very neat formulae here that quantify the extent to which it is desirable to do that. But that is basically the main insight here, is to prove that it is always the case that to pay that extra cost. Now, that doesn't fully answer the question, which sector, what good? It may not pay Argentina to go into competing with China, with Switzerland on watches. And the hardest question, theory can't really answer so cleanly, is the one you posed, that basically Switzerland is now getting rents, excess profits from their technological advantage in making watches. And some other country has rents from their technological advances in making some other good. The question is, which of those ranks can you partly appropriate for Argentina by making those investments? Can you partially catch up? You may not ever fully catch up, but you may be that you can take away a niche of the market. Do you follow me? It may be that there may be some niche of that market that you can take away, and that's what you know. I gave the example of Brazil. It's actually quite interesting that now they moved into a niche that nobody was in before, which was ethanol, sugar-based ethanol, and they were able to do that. They moved into a niche where several people were trying, and they succeeded, which was how do you convert ethanol into plastic on a commercial basis. They succeeded in that as well. China succeeded in bringing down the cost of making solar panels much more effectively than the United States. One of the reasons is the government was willing to make more of a commitment to doing it.
Okay, so the question is about what do you think determines the capacity of emerging economies to appropriate from the creation of knowledge, considering the implications of the intellectual property rights, and if you could extend more on how to design intellectual property rights to ensure that emerging economies can actually appropriate the knowledge if they create it.
Yeah. So there are many aspects of this. First, let me emphasize, there's no single intellectual property regime. There are many different designs of the intellectual property regime, and so it's not like there is a single framework. And when I said before that there's a need for a developmentally oriented intellectual property regime, what that says is that developing countries ought to think very consciously about what kind of an intellectual property regime is appropriate for their country, which is very different from one that is appropriate for, say, the United States. The second point is that I mentioned that in the United States there's a broad, increasing consensus that the intellectual property regime is counterproductive. In the following sense, even in the absence of an intellectual property regime, firms have an incentive to do research. In most areas, it's not true in all areas, but in most areas, firms still have an incentive to do research because there's what's called a first mover advantage. When you're the first in a market, you get customers. And then the question is, does having intellectual property beyond what is natural lead to more or less innovation, taking into account several things? First, I mentioned before that intellectual property makes access to knowledge more difficult, and knowledge is the most important input into the production of knowledge. Secondly, intellectual property creates a culture of secrecy, because when you associate money with knowledge, you encourage people not to share that knowledge. So one of the problems in some universities, some countries where universities have strong intellectual property, is that universities have become a less open place for discussing ideas, because people worried about the sharing that knowledge may lead to somebody getting their property rights. Thirdly, there's a problem called the patent thicket. Whenever anybody in the United States makes an innovation, particularly in area of software, they get sued because somebody will claim that they are trespassing on their intellectual property. There's a whole industry called trolls. They're equivalent to, you know about the vulture funds? In patent law, these are the same thing. They perform the same role that vulture funds do in the hedge fund community. an example was, I was involved in a case a couple years ago where a small company who had done just a couple $1 million of research, but then spent millions of dollars on lawyers, sued Intel, saying that Intel, who had spent billions of dollars developing their advanced chip, was intruding on their patent. And in this particular part of America's intellectual property regime, this little company had the right to shut down Intel unless Intel paid them a big enough bribe not to be shut down. It was really, and they were demanding, you know, they had invested, as I say, a couple $1 million in research, and they were demanding humongous amounts to say, if you don't want us to shut you down, you have to bribe us and give us a big bribe. Fortunately, in the law, there was this very peculiar provision that there was an exception that if it was against the general interest, you would not shut them down. That particular provision on general welfare, general interest, had only been exercised 4 times in 40 years. So I had a very easy job to say shutting down Intel, shutting down Apple, shutting down all the advanced HP computers was probably, in the middle of the US recession, not good economic policy. And the court bought that idea. So they did not shut down Intel. But that was what our intellectual property regime does. And then there's a whole set of provisions about access to health that most people know about. The TPP is an example of an unbalanced intellectual property regime where the US, inside the United States, there's a very big fight. We reached an agreement between the generic companies and the big pharma about a quarter century ago about how to get a balance. I didn't think it was balanced, but it was relatively balanced. Big pharma and generics got 87% of the sales, but big pharma got a majority of the profits. But under TPP, they've upset that balance and tried to provide a new intellectual property regime, which is 100% in favor of big pharma. Not 100%, but very much more in favor of big pharma. So the point I want to make is that designing a pro-development intellectual property regime is not going to be easy, but within the WTO, within TRIPS, there is scope for doing a lot more. India showed that, and they passed an intellectual property regime that was consistent with WTO. The United States was very unhappy, but they've used that, and they've been able to use that to maintain their generic medicine industry. But one has to be very careful signing international trade agreements where the space to have a pro-development intellectual property regime is increasingly being restricted.
Okay, Joe, we are taking the time of another panel, so I'm afraid we are out of time.
Okay.
No. So we won't take more questions, but let me close. I'm going to switch to Spanish. Lamentablemente nos quedamos sin tiempo. Hay un panel adicional ahora sobre políticas macroeconómicas en crisis que va a cerrar el workshop de crisis macroeconómicas. Quiero cerrar con algunos agradecimientos. Primero, bueno, a Rich, a la UBA, que hizo un gran esfuerzo para que esto sea posible, a sus autoridades, sus profesores y su staff, a los sponsors, incluyendo a Patricio Farcuh, presidente y CEO de OCA, a Sebastián Seria, un ex estudiante de la Universidad Pública Argentina, hoy en Día Empresario en Nueva York, que donó una cantidad de dinero importante para que esto sea posible, al Institute for New Economic Thinking, que también financió en parte las actividades de un workshop de estudiantes que, como Andrés López les contó, se desarrolló al mismo tiempo que los workshops para los investigadores. Fue una gran actividad, creo, porque hubo chicos de todo el país. Creo que dimos, si no recuerdo mal, 35 becas a estudiantes de toda Argentina y 2 a gente de Colombia, de la Universidad Javeriana. Este workshop, de hecho, termina mañana. El profesor Joseph Stiglitz va a estar dictando una clase para los alumnos. Así que, bueno, un lujo tener a los alumnos argentinos escuchando directamente una clase del profesor Stiglitz. Les agradezco a los chicos que participaron en la organización de este workshop. Un trabajo también muy fuerte. Me acuerdo de Fernanda Villafañe, Patricia Romero, Germán Reyes, Pablo Jack, Juan Pablo Aguad. Seguro me olvido de alguien. Y finalmente, agradecerle al profesor Joseph Stiglitz. Tengo el gran privilegio de primera mano ver lo brillante que es al pensar. Así que, bueno, que haya compartido sus pensamientos sobre procesos de desarrollo, la importancia de la ventaja comparativa dinámica, los instrumentos para implementar transformaciones que pueden llevar a que las sociedades operen de una forma más sana desde su democracia y más dinámica desde la economía. Temas que son de gran importancia para Argentina, que claramente aún no hemos logrado resolver, así que nos ayuda a pensar en esos temas. Se lo agradecemos mucho y los invito a despedirlo con un gran aplauso.